Narayana Samarambam Vyasa Shankara Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om Vasudevendra Yogindram Natva Jnana Pradam Gurum Mumukshunam Hitartaya Tattva Bodho Vidiyate. In the last video, we started a discussion about Maya. The question is asked, how can there be a not self when the text says that the self is non-dual? How can there be a not self? How can there be objects? How can there be a creation when the self is non-dual? And the text says that the appearance of the not self is caused by Maya. The important thing to remember there is that when we ask, why is there a not self? The real answer is that in truth, there isn't a not self. There's only the appearance of a not self. So ultimately, the question of why is there a not self? Why is there a creation? How does that creation come to be? Is rendered pointless by the knowledge of non-duality. However, in order to get there, we take the appearance of the creation at face value and investigate it in order to be able to see that actually it's not real. So when asked, why is there a not self? Vedanta says there is Maya. Maya is a power that appears in you in the self. What the text says, though, is that this is a power that depends on the self for its apparent existence. That means that there is no actual Maya in the same way that there's no actual creation. If there's no actual creation, then there's definitely not a cause for that creation that doesn't really exist. So this means that the creation or objects have the exact same status as their cause, Maya. So that status is what? Is mithya. So everything that we have learned about objects up until this point, how objects are not actually real, why they are not real, all of those things apply equally to Maya, because a cause and its effects will have the same status. Maya causes unreal objects. So therefore, Maya itself has to be unreal. A real cause cannot create unreal objects. Only an unreal cause can create unreal objects. Now this brings up a particular point here of whether or not the self becomes the creation or not. And there is a theory that says the self transforms into the effects, into the creation, into the objects. But based on what I just said, that can't be possible. We've established that the self is real, that the self actually exists. So the self can't become unreal objects that don't actually exist. If it did, then it would change its fundamental nature and no longer exist. Okay? Because if the self is real and existent, and then it transforms into an unreal object that doesn't actually exist, then the self is gone. A typical example of that kind of transformation would be the transformation of milk to yogurt or milk to cheese. When you take milk and you change it into yogurt, for example, the milk essentially is gone. You can't take the yogurt and transform it back into milk. There's an actual transformation that occurs. So if we're saying that the self actually transforms into the objects, into mithya, then the self is gone, because the self, or anything for that matter, cannot have two contradictory natures at the same time. You can't have something that's both real and unreal at the exact same time. The same way that you can't have a dark sun or a cold fire. The nature of the sun is light. It cannot be both light and dark at the same time. The nature of fire is heat. So fire cannot be both hot and cold at the same time. It is illogical and impossible. So we have this situation. If we say that the self transforms into the creation, then that means there essentially would be no self, because the self is existent, the self is real, the self is ever present, the self is unchanging. If it actually becomes objects which do not actually exist, which are not actually real, which are not always present, and which constantly change, then you have lost the self. However, we've seen through inquiry that there definitely is a self. There definitely is an ever-present, unchanging self. So that's not the case. That self did not become the objects. It did not become the creation the same way, in the way that milk becomes yogurt or milk becomes cheese. That's not the case here. Okay? So we can't have one thing here becoming the other, or else there is no self. But we've seen through inquiry that there definitely is a self. And we can't have the self change its nature, because it can't be both real and unreal, or existent and not actually existent at the same time. Okay? We can't have a cold fire. Okay? We can't have a both existent and non-existent self at the same time. Okay? That also could not be the case. Furthermore, if the nature of something is, the nature of the self is to be real. That's what it actually is. If that's what its nature is, then it will always be that. You can have something that has incidental attributes that change, but what it fundamentally is the same. Like water, for instance, can be liquid or it can be solid. The liquid aspect of the water or the solid aspect of the water are incidental attributes that come and go. However, water itself always remains water. Okay? Water is always hydrogen and oxygen molecules. Whether it's frozen or liquid, it's always the same. Being liquid or frozen are incidental. They're not always present. However, the water always is present, always is water. Okay? So we can't have something change its fundamental nature. If the self is real, its fundamental nature does not change. And if it is actually something by its fundamental nature, it can't change. That's the whole point of saying that something has a fundamental nature. So if the nature of the self is to exist, it cannot become something that doesn't actually exist. Okay? Only something that doesn't actually exist can become something or change into something else that doesn't actually exist. You can't have something that is real change into something that's unreal, or else it wasn't real in the first place, because the definition of real is unchanging. So for all of those reasons, we can rule out the theory or the idea that the self transforms into the creation. Now, if we've ruled that out, then how do we explain this creation? The second way to look at this is that it's only an apparent transformation. There's no actual transformation, just the appearance of one. The example of the water that I just used applies here. Okay, when water freezes or when water is liquid, there is an apparent change in the water, but the water itself always remains water. Its fundamental nature as water, as hydrogen and oxygen molecules, never changes. We can go back to the famous ring here. The silver that the ring is made out of can have an apparent change. Okay, it might be circular. You could melt it and turn it into an earring. You could stretch it out and make it into a necklace. However, the change of the silver is only apparent. There's no actual change in the silver itself, which is all that's here. There's only silver. No matter what outward or apparent change the silver has, it always remains silver. The nature of the silver always stays the same. It's the same situation with clay and a pot. You can have clay. It can be in the shape of a small pot, a big pot. It can be a cup. It can be a saucer. It could be made into the shape of a horse or an owl, or any other kind of shape at all that you can think of. And despite that outward apparent change, the fundamental nature of the clay remains the same. And that is what happens with the creation of objects. The creation of objects is only apparent. There's only the appearance of change, when in fact the self is present and completely unchanged, the same way that clay is present and totally unchanged, the same way that silver is present and totally unchanged. No matter what appearance of change happens, the self is always present and unchanged, no matter what appearance of objects may come or go. So it's only an apparent change. There is no actual change. The self does not become the objects. The self, which is real, does not become unreal objects. The self which exists does not become objects that don't actually exist. It only seems to. So the question then is, well, how does this seeming creation happen? How does this seeming appearance of objects happen? And Vedanta says it is by this power that is called Maya. Maya makes the self appear to change. But Maya in and of itself, just like the objects that it creates, is not real. It does not actually exist in and of itself. It is not a dependently existent real entity, and that's an important point to make. So all objects, as we've learned, are mithya, and Maya, which creates objects, is also mithya. Now, you might say, well, you're talking in circles, Vishnu, because you're saying that objects, which are mithya, are caused by Maya, which is mithya. So you're saying that the cause of mithya is mithya? Well, on the one hand, yes, because if you have an object and the nature of that object is mithya, it can't come from anything other than something that's nature is also mithya. A mithya object cannot be created by something that is satya. Something that satya can't even create because something that is satya, or the self, doesn't change. So naturally, yes, we're saying that all mithya or unreal objects are created by a mithya unreal power called Maya. They have the exact same status. And again, it is a valid question or a valid doubt to say, well, that's circular reasoning. I'm asking you what the cause of mithya is, and you're saying the cause of mithya is Maya, which is mithya. So mithya causes mithya. Well, that may not seem to make a lot of sense, and I can see that point. But the other point that I'm going to make is that we've established What about mithya? That it defies logic. It is not explainable. How do you explain something that is not real? How can you explain something that doesn't actually exist? That's the whole point here. Let's try, like I've mentioned before, it's like trying to explain a cartoon character. You say, why does Bugs Bunny do what Bugs Bunny does? Why does Bugs Bunny harass Elmer Fudd and eat carrots? Why does Mickey Mouse love Minnie Mouse? These are ultimately questions that you can't answer because you're asking a question about something that isn't real. How do you explain something that isn't real? Something that exists and you can experience but doesn't have any reality. There's no explanation for that. That is the whole definition of mithya. So we're saying that the appearance of objects is caused by Maya, both because Maya is mithya, its effects are also mithya. And it may not seem to make sense that mithya can cause mithya, but mithya in and of itself cannot be explained. Now, we may seem to hit a wall there. But again, the definition of mithya is something that has no actual existence. So we can say, well, how can mithya cause mithya? And the answer is that ultimately that question is not relevant because there is no real mithya. You're asking for the explanation of something that doesn't actually exist. In truth, there's only you, the non-dual self. There's only satya. There's only the appearance of mithya when you don't understand what your true nature is. You can say, well, I see this appearance. Well, I'm not going to argue that with you. I see the appearance too. However, the difference is when you have self-knowledge, when self-ignorance is removed, either way you want to look at it, where there's still the appearance of something, you understand that it's actually only the self. In the same way that you can have the appearance of a water fountain or an ice cube, and you know that both the ice cube and the water fountain, despite differences in appearance, are really only water. You can have a small clay pot and a big clay pot, and you know that despite any outward appearances, really all that's there is just clay. You only see difference when you believe in the unreal appearance of name and form. So ultimately, there is no creation. Ultimately, there is no Maya. There is no mithya. All of these questions are resolved in that knowledge. But in order to get that knowledge, you have to make an inquiry. And where that inquiry starts is with the appearance of objects. I mean, as I said, no one can deny the experience of the appearance of objects. So to simply say there are no actual objects when someone says, why are there objects, isn't helpful. So that is why Vedanta gives this explanation of Maya. Maya is what makes the impossible possible. It is what makes you, the non-dual self, appear to be a multiplicity of objects. It's what makes you, the unchanging self, appear to be ever-changing objects. It's what makes you, the non-dual self, appear to be a duality. The duality of self and not self, of subject and object. Maya is that power. However, ultimately, Maya has no reality. And that's what needs to be kept in mind as we work our way through this part of the text. Because sometimes people get very hung up on the particulars of Maya when that really isn't the point. we're trying to investigate Maya only for the reason of trying to come to the conclusion of non-duality. We're investigating the nature of objects to first see that they aren't real, to break our identification with the objects, and then ultimately to see that there really are no actual objects. There's only you, the non-dual self. So, how can there be a creation, a not self, if the self is non-dual, unchanging, and actionless? It is owing to Maya, a power that depends on the self for its apparent existence. And now this next part of the text is going to start to explain what Maya is, how Maya is composed of 3 gunas, which can be loosely translated as qualities. Maya is composed of the 3 gunas, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. The explanation of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas helps us to understand how Maya can create, how creation will be at least apparently possible through Maya. This is a system of philosophy that was borrowed from Samkhya. There's several different systems of classical Indian philosophy, Samkhya being one of them, and Samkhya has this theoretical model of creation that is based on the 3 gunas. Samkhya and Vedanta are not exactly the same, although Vedanta has borrowed some of this stuff from Samkhya. Again, I say this is a theoretical model, and it's okay that Vedanta borrowed it from Samkhya because Vedanta is not trying to establish the reality of the world. Vedanta is only using these temporary explanations of the world to help us investigate it and to help us to see that it has no actual reality, that where we see this world, there's only us, there's only you, there's only me, the self, the non-dual self. So as I said, the three gunas of Maya are Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. So what are these 3 powers? Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. When we look at what it takes to have a creation, we can see what Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas are. Generally speaking, we can say that Sattva is knowledge or intelligence, skill. Rajas is power or energy or change. And Tamas is substance or matter. So the analogy that I use in my commentary on Tattva Bodha is that of building a house. Okay, so the house is our creation. Now, what's the very first thing that you need to create this house? Well, first you have to have intelligence, you have to have knowledge, you have to have skill. I mean, you have to have knowledge to think up the idea of the house in the first place. You have to have knowledge of how to build the house in order to make a blueprint or a plan of how to do it. And furthermore, you have to have the requisite skill based on knowledge to be able to enact those plans, to carry out that blueprint. So in the macrocosmic sense, meaning looking at the creation as a whole, okay, you have to first have sattva. You have to have knowledge or intelligence or the idea of what you're going to create, because you're not going to create something if you don't have the idea for it first. And that is sattva. We can see evidence of sattva. Okay, sattva might sound like a fancy Sanskrit word, but when we just kind of look around, we can see that this creation obviously had to start with a particular idea first. So there is our sattva. Now, once you have the idea for a creation, such as this house, what are you going to need then? I mean, the blueprint, the idea of the house is laying out this structure, but how can you build that structure if you don't have the proper materials? You're going to have wood, metal, stone, all of these things in order to be able to take your idea and make it an actual thing. So with the Gunas, in relation to the creation, this is Tamas. Tamas is the cause of the actual substance of the creation. So we can also see that. We can see, for instance, when we look at a guitar, that there had to be an idea for the guitar in the first place. So there's the knowledge. We know that there has to be skill based on knowledge in order to make the guitar. So we see that. We see the Sattva there. We see this idea, this knowledge, this skill. And then we can also look at the guitar and say, okay, well, there's wood there, there's metal there, there's plastic there. And that is the material of that creation. So at this point, we've got that material, which is tamas, and the idea, which is sattva. So even though these things sound like something fancy or even mystical, we can observe them in our own common everyday experience. You look around, you see substance. We're just saying that that substance is caused by the tamas aspect of Maya. Whatever form that substance has taken was caused by the sattva aspect of Maya, which is knowledge or intelligence. So if we have the idea and we have the material or substance, do we have a creation? No, we don't, because it's not going to do any good to have the idea and the materials or the substance if we can't transform that substance into the object of the creation. So if I have the knowledge and the skill to think up a creation, a house or a guitar, if I have the materials to make that house or the guitar, but I don't have any energy or power to transform the substance according to my idea, then I don't have any creation. And this is where rajas comes in. Rajas is power or energy. And we can also see this very plainly in the apparent world, in the apparent creation. Energy is known to us easily. Power is known to us. Change is known to us. That by which one thing is transformed into another, that is the power of rajas. Again, rajas sounds like a fancy word. It's a fancy Sanskrit word, but it's just an observable fact about the apparent reality. And we can see power, energy, change. We know that that is something that is a part of the creation. So those three factors, okay, we're saying that Maya is composed of these three factors. Maya is responsible for creation. Now, how is that possible? Well, because Maya has sattva, rajas, and tamas, it has intelligence, knowledge, and skill, it has energy and power, and it has the ability to make substance. And this is the whole idea behind Maya, and it makes sense. Because if we say Maya is creating, then it has to have the ability to do that. One point to make is that if Maya is responsible for the whole creation, then Maya can also be viewed as the totality of all knowledge, of all skill, of all power. It would have to be. In order to create the entire creation, it would have to have all of the knowledge required to make the entire creation. And that knowledge would be the totality of all knowledge. Similarly, to have the power to create everything, it would have to have the totality of power, the totality of energy. And to have the substance to create the entire creation, it would also have to have the totality of all substance. So Maya is this creative power. It is all knowledge, it is all power, and it is all substance. And that is the powers of Maya, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Now, Maya, which is composed of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, is the unmanifest cause of all of the manifest objects that make up creation. So the question might come up, how does this unmanifest cause, which is composed of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, become all of the manifest objects? And that will be the topic that is taken up in the next section of the text. Purnamidaf, Purnamidam, Purnat, Purnamadachyate, Purnasya, Purnamadaya, Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.